most of software development is not the coding of Tetris when you think of it. That is hardly the hard part of the problem. Like, so much of software development is honestly 5 years ago, we really still thought the AI was going to free us to do art and music. But in fact, it does art and music better than the average person can do art or music. I'm saying if you can even imagine AI taking 5% of the jobs, I don't know, and I think anybody who claims to know is almost definitely wrong.
Hi, I'm Boris Epstein. I started First 10 to help founders build the best early engineering teams in the startup space. And this is the First 10 podcast, where early engineers, founders, and investors join me to share their secrets on building the best early engineering teams in the space. Joining us is Philip Su, a name synonymous with foundational impact across some of the most influential tech giants. Philip began his journey by turning down a Stanford PhD program in favor of a 12-year career at Microsoft. He then moved to Facebook, now Meta, as the second employee in their Seattle office. Picture this. Philip was the single full-time engineer who created and implemented the entire Facebook video calling feature. He then went on to found and lead Facebook's London engineering office, scaling it from 12 to 600. But beyond these remarkable achievements, Philip's insights are enriched by unique experiences, including his time as an Amazon warehouse associate, a role he took to combat burnout and depression, which gave him a humbling perspective on work and society. Most recently, Philip was the Seattle site lead and member of technical staff at OpenAI, where he helped build and ship the Mac and Windows ChatGPT apps, making him uniquely positioned to discuss the frontier of AI and its implications. Philip Su, welcome to the First 10 podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. How do we do with that intro in terms of accuracy?
Now, the one thing, if we could modify a little, if you don't mind, is I started on video calling on my own, but pretty soon 2 people were added to ship the product with me. So I actually shipped with 2 other engineers together. Is it possible to modify what we say there so it doesn't sound like I'm saying that I did the whole thing?
Yeah, and we've got me saying the inaccurate intro statement and you correcting me, so we are good on that front. So do credit where credit is due.
Great, yeah, super. Thank you so much.
Cool, all exciting stuff, and excited to get into it. But first, I'm curious, what was the last supercar that you drove and where?
Yeah, let's think about this. I think the most recent one was probably a McLaren of some sort. I'm not sure that I remember correctly, but I think in the UK, McLarens you can rent pretty easily, and so that was an amazing car to try out.
Amazing. And are you into supercars, and what is that about?
I was for a little while because, when I was younger, I had the Lamborghinis on my desktop wallpaper and stuff like that. And I think we had saved up a while, and I had seen that there was a red Lamborghini Diablo SV that was repoed in Vegas as a car, and it had gotten cheaper than a new Porsche. And so I thought, okay, this would be great to at least buy it, fix it up, and whatnot. And it really was an amazing experience because I was too cheap to go to the dealership, for instance, to get the clutch changed. And so changing a clutch on a Lamborghini is an engine and transmission out job. So you have to fish the entire 12-cylinder out of the back of the car and actually take the transmission out with it and change the clutch and whatnot. So I learned a lot more about cars trying to fix that car than I did driving it.
Wow. It sounds like a pretty awesome thing to be into. If I kind of out myself and say that I've never not only been in, but driven in a supercar, how much am I missing out on life?
Yeah, really nothing at all is my opinion. And there are 2 things about that. One is people forget that modern cars are just tremendously fast. So the Lamborghini Diablo SV in 97, 98 was something like the world's fastest production sports car, right? It did 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. Today, the average Tesla can easily take a second off of that. You know what I mean? And so the everyday car that you drive today, or even a base Porsche 911, is faster than that. So I think the average commuter car today is better than a supercar was in the 90s. So you're really not missing terribly much. And then the other thing about it is also, as I did more things on circuits, on tracks driving, I realized that it's much better to have a cheap track car than it is to have an expensive exotic sports car. So something like a $20,000 Caterham would beat the pants off of most things.
Fascinating. Okay. I appreciate what you said, but this does make me want to go get into a supercar. So I might just go and do that. Okay, cool. Let's jump into it. So you've had a very interesting journey, right? From getting into the Stanford PhD program, but then choosing to not move forward, then spending 12 years at Microsoft, then Meta, then OpenAI, and with some interesting entrepreneurial experiences in between. What's a memorable turning point or a pivotal moment through all of that that led you to where you are today?
I feel like there are a few key transition points. One was switching out from Microsoft to Facebook pretty early on in Facebook's lifetime. I switched into Facebook when it was 500 engineers globally. And people forget back then. People think that it was a for sure guaranteed success, but that wasn't the case back then. In 2010, there was still a lot of question about MySpace coming back. Google was rumored to come out with G+ soon. And so there was a lot of uncertainty. I think joining that after leaving Microsoft, since I've worked at Microsoft 12 years starting straight out of college, it was my only professional job ever. So it was actually kind of scary to leave, because I understood the corporate culture. I understood what worked there. Having not worked anywhere else, I was worried whether or not I would fit in a new place. I think switching to Facebook helped both build my self-confidence in understanding that, I have some skills that are repurposable in other companies. But also joining a company that was only 500 engineers after working at Microsoft felt like such a change where I learned a lot of stuff about how software can be built very differently with smaller companies versus larger companies. And with an average talent level that back then the talent density was a lot higher at tiny Facebook versus the general talent at Microsoft, to see that you can run a lot leaner on process when you can rely on the people to be good and to be careful. And so those were a lot of learnings for me. I think a second transition point for me was later on moving from the for-profit to the nonprofit world. When I quit Facebook, I had started a Seattle-based startup called OutArray. That's a nonprofit that builds free software for global health. And I think working in the nonprofit space, which we can talk about later if you want, is very different from the for-profit space. But I think that first transition from Microsoft out to Facebook was a massive shift in my mindset and a huge source of learning.
I can see that being a big deal because, if you spent so much time at Microsoft, and I hear this from others who have spent developed considerable tenure at companies, they're like this concept of like I can only leave this company once, so like it really must be like the one. And Facebook was smaller and it was certainly up and coming, but like you said, what Meta has become today was considered fairly beyond those people's imaginations at that time.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it definitely felt to me like a risky move, but I also felt it was risky not to move because here's what happened. I had gotten to what Microsoft calls level 67, but just a little below the partner level at Microsoft. When I interviewed to leave Microsoft, I interviewed with Amazon, Google, Facebook, and maybe one local startup. And all of them gave me what were equivalent to level 64 offers, right? When the first level 64 offer came in way below what I was leveled at Microsoft, I thought, I just interviewed poorly. I'm sure it'll be fine. Once, 3 level 64 offers came in, what I realized was that my value to Microsoft as a corporation was disproportionately high relative to what the industry valued me at. You might remember back then, Microsoft was mostly working on boxed product that ships every 3 years, these enterprise agreements, software being upgraded very sporadically, very long distance, sort of long ship cycle things. Most of the other companies I talked to were into, continuous deployment, like that sort of thing. My skill set was just not there. And so once I got 3 offers that were all several levels below where I was at Microsoft, I figured I really need to move right now or never. I either need to work at Microsoft until I can retire, or I need to gain some skills that the rest of the industry feels are relevant. And so I felt like it really was a last chance for me to leave and build something else that was more well-rounded than my time at Microsoft.
Fascinating. And Microsoft is known for its tenure. So I know for a fact there are many people that chose the latter and have chosen to kind of build entire careers with the company. So now I could see in looking back how that was such a pivotal moment, because it led to such, all the great things you did, both at Facebook, right, then Meta, then OpenAI, and so on and so forth.
That's right.
So, speaking of Microsoft, so you spent 12 years there and you grew to, you said, level 67. What is that in title terms?
Yeah, probably senior staff engineer is what a person might call it. In a company like Google or Meta, probably an E7 engineer.
Okay. And what is it? I'd consider that to be pretty successful. What does it take for one to, develop that level of success at a, Microsoft or an equivalent?
Yeah, I feel like it's very dependent on the individual. So going from a junior level to a senior software developer, for instance, I think you can be shaped like most people and get there no problem. And that's like, for Microsoft, they would call that like a career level. Once you hit a senior software developer, you're welcome to stay there for the rest of your life, if that's what you want. But I think to get from senior to principal or to staff engineer at one of the other companies, I think the staff engineers often have very different archetypes. Some of them are super prolific coders, like just very, very good at it. Some of them are great at software architecture, technical design, this sort of thing. Some are really great at rallying the team behind something, so they're great at vision and communication. I think that's one of the difficult things people find is they grow early in their career pretty easily. And many people end up stalling right around that level 65 principal level, either getting into principal or advancing in those principal or staff levels into senior staff. And I think one of the main reasons for that slowing down is that not everybody recognizes that what got them there won't get them to the next place, right? That many times what's expected shifts in the sort of the quality and the quantity of what you do shifts. And so many people don't adapt to that. For myself personally, I think I got to that level primarily through being a very good generalist. So I'm excited to work on small projects, do anything. I'm excited to test the product if that's what the product needs. I'm happy to fill in and write a product manager doc, like a spec for something if that's what's needed. So I think my general applicability and excitedness of working across the spectrum of things is probably what got me to those levels. But everybody gets there in a different way.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm hearing. I heard 2 things come out of that. One is to like almost reset yourself at every level, because every level has a unique set of of requirements to be respectively successful. Like, you can't just kind of rely on what you did the last level, and then 2, in this case, generalist for specialist. But like you said, I'm sure there's huge value placed on specialization as it relates to growth as well.
That's right.
Fascinating. So I want to change gears a little bit. You spent some time at OpenAI, and then you just recently moved on to start your own startup. And after having spent time at OpenAI and seeing what the world of AI looks like, I'm really curious. Can you talk a little bit about what you're building and why you chose to go in this direction of the I'm sure many directions you could have chosen to go into?
Yeah, I'm building a small piece of software that is a podcast player called Superphonic. And the reason I went into that is because I am a huge podcast fan. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. And for a long time, I was a paying member of Overcast, which is another player. But I felt like there were small things I wanted to improve on it, and eventually some big things that I wanted to do in the space that no other podcast player was doing. So that's why I was excited to start my own thing. But I'm essentially a lone developer. I have a buddy in Brazil who works with me on some of the code every day, and that's been great. I have a designer in Nigeria that works with me on the visual design. But overall, like, it's meant to be a small project. So I don't intend to raise money. I don't intend to blow this thing out huge. But it is very amusing to me because I am a huge user of podcast players. And so I love being able to control exactly what I get out of them.
Fascinating. So it's really based on, where you like to, where you've spent your time, something that you noticed either was missing or could have been done better. And it's just kind of a what you're like a fun kind of lifestyle type project, and you'll see where it goes.
Yeah, totally. Like, for instance, let me just rattle off random things. Superphonic is the world's first podcast player to allow you to subscribe to topics, not just feeds. No podcast player right now allows you to subscribe to a topic, which I find is like odd and like it's weird. No one has thought of this. Real-time reactions. We're about to release that. The idea that you can react throughout the podcast, right? This is helpful not only for a sense of community, like you understand you're listening with others, but you can imagine for podcast creators, this is very helpful to know the content that people love the most. It has an internal audio feed that's like a news feed, because I find that sharing and discovery of podcasts is especially difficult compared to sharing and discovery of either videos or text, right? So I feel like that's missing from the social media platforms. There are just so many things that I think the typical podcast player, for whatever reason, hasn't really thought of. And I love the ability, the agency to be able to build those things directly.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about any of those things either. I listened to some handful of podcasts. I can't say that I'm, like a super fan or anything. But I would have assumed that those features that you mentioned like exist and are fairly common. So, wow.
No, it's surprising. And I don't know if that's because many places don't treat the podcasts as sort of a high value thing. So for instance, the world's largest podcast player right now by a smidge is Spotify, but nobody subscribes to Spotify for the podcasts, right? You like join Spotify for the music. You get the podcast as an aside. So I can guarantee that player is focused primarily on music playback, right? And then you have Apple Podcasts, which is the world's second largest podcast player. That one is bundled within the OS. And so there's not a huge motive to make that super great because it was there. You'll recall podcasts were called podcasts in order to launch the iPod, which back then had almost no content. And so they had to invent this idea of like podcasts. It's like audio broadcasts. And so for Apple, the podcast app, when they first launched iPod, was incredibly important, right? But now that the iPhone is hugely successful and nobody buys an iPhone because it has the podcast player in it, I suspect that the company just doesn't value innovation in that space that much.
Interesting. And you'd think they would, just given the magnitude of podcast content that exists, that is continued to be created, the value of podcasts in society.
Yeah. Well, right now, I bet they pay more attention to it than they did a few years ago, right? Now, given the elections in America being swung partly by podcasts and things like this, I bet someone there is now paying more attention to it. But it might be similar to, as you recall, like having the internet browser at Microsoft, right? Microsoft was for a while hugely interested when Netscape was a big company, right? And then Microsoft lost enough interest to cancel the browser. And I think a similar thing can happen with the podcast app in the OS. It's a bundled application that was viewed as essential when the OS first shipped. Eventually, it was viewed as like a side gig that nobody cared about. And now there's the whoops moment probably of like, oh, actually, this thing is important. Let's like reconstitute a browser team and get this done. So I suspect that something like that might be happening also.
That's awesome. Well, I wish you great success with the building of the player, and I wish that it becomes huge, and maybe you'll have to make a choice of growing out your team, and maybe the first 10 podcasts will be featured on it one day. So I wish for all those things.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And we should totally talk afterwards about featuring, because I want to be a player that allows the content creator, for instance, to have bonus material that can be added on, an ability to subscribe or to tip on a certain podcast episode if you found it very helpful, right? And so I want to be able to do those things. So let's talk offline on whether First 10 might be something that we can partner on.
I would love to do that. So something I'm curious about, Philip, you've now built software in a handful of different, what I just kind of think of as software development eras, right? Like times when, different types of software was built, from your time at Microsoft to your time building large consumer scale to your time building AI at OpenAI, and now, what's it like building today, Superphonic as compared to some of the different eras that you've built in?
Yeah. I feel like engineers have an easier time than ever in some ways, and in some ways it's harder than ever. So first, the easy stuff. I think the tools are so much better. Like you consider how long Visual Studio, for instance, was the stalwart, right? Of like, oh, this is a product development environment, blah, blah, blah. And then you have VS Code come out and it's really beating the pants off of Visual Studio, right? And then eventually you have AI integrated into IDEs like Cursor, which is a great example where Microsoft had the lead on something, but it let someone else basically run with it because it neglected the things it could obviously do to make it better, right? So I think that the development environments and the tools have gotten so much stronger. AI assistance allows the average developer to do far more varieties of things than they could do before. So, for example, a friend of mine is developing a software game right now, but he is a code writer. He is no good at digital assets or anything like that. But he had Google's VO3 create an intro video, like one of those splash screen ones that announce the game developer's name, right? And I watched this thing and it was amazing. It was mind blowing. And he said that he thinks the amortized cost was a few dollars to create that,
Wow.
right? And if you were a developer just even 5 years ago and you wanted an animated splash screen for your big program, for your big game, I'm guessing you would have had to pay thousands of dollars for that, right? So software developers, on one hand, have become more powerful than ever, so things are getting easier than ever. But on the other hand, software is getting much more complex in the sort of the environment that it lives in. So it used to be that you could release a shareware game on your bulletin board and it just runs on your computer, and then that was that, right? These days, you can't create a game and release it without like networking features, top 10 score leaderboards, like social media stuff attached to it, right? In-app purchases, because that's how you're going to make money on the game. Like things have gotten, the environment of deployment has gotten a lot richer. So you can't just deploy any old mobile app now. You almost definitely have to have Cloud Lambdas functions running over there, some sort of distributed authentication. Like a lot of things like that have gotten, in a way, more complex.
Right. And before, it probably would have, the way you're describing, like the feature set of kind of, insert product here, it would have taken a much longer and a much larger team to build. But you said like right now you're essentially, building with yourself and, counterpart or two. So you're able to build a lot more faster and with less, it sounds like.
Right. And I think that that will create a world in which startups increasingly can get impactful much smaller, with much less sort of upfront capital, which is great, right? Like this is the huge difference between hardware startups and software startups. My brother works in chip design. And so like every chip tape out is like $1 million minimum with TSMC, right? So like when you're running a startup like that, 4 or 5 tape outs, you can run your startup entirely out of money, right? So that is a huge difference. Is software has always had that advantage, and now it's going to have that advantage 10x, 100x, because now you don't need 10 developers to make like a reasonable mobile game. You probably need 1.5, right? So I do think that is a win for customers for sure, because the competition is always good. But I also think that for software developers, they have to acknowledge that the competition, like the moats that you can build by writing great software, is a lot smaller than they've ever been.
Fascinating. And so from, for someone like you who came from a software, I imagine that I know that naturally lowers the barrier for those that don't come from a software engineering background. But from your perspective, who came from, what I consider a pretty prolific software engineering background. I mean, do you feel like you could just kind of now do things like with your eyes closed, or do you kind of like still, bring your full engineering abilities to the table, and now you just feel like a total kind of like super, talk about 10x, 100x engineers? Are you kind of more in that camp with the
Right.
environment today?
I feel like my experience with AI integrated into a product like Cursor is a little bit bimodal. When I'm working in environments I'm very familiar with, so that would be things like React Native, TypeScript, things like Firebase, Cloud Functions, things like that. I find I spend more time frustratingly like correcting the prompt and like teaching the AI, like, oh, that's not what I want to do. I want to blah, blah, right? So that I find mildly frustrating. But the place where I think I'm getting 10, 20x is in areas that I never wanted to learn and I don't want to invest in learning. So it does very well in, for instance, updating your Z shell profile, right? Like, how do you write a Z shell function that does X or Y? I do not want to learn the arcane sort of symbology that makes that happen, right? On Windows, if I were on Windows, it would be like batch file stuff. Like, do I really want to learn how to do this, right? For me, on the Superphonic podcast product, what I do is the few components I need to write in native, in Swift or Objective-C, I do not honestly want to invest a lot of time in learning Swift. And you know how coders, if you don't know the language, you can read it just fine. Like, I can read Swift files and probably find an error in a Swift file, but I do not want to compose a Swift file de novo out of nothing, right? And so in cases like that, I think the AI easily saves me 10 to 20x the amount of time that I would have put into it.
And so you're saving the time, but you're not really like working. Are you working less, or are you just building way more, but in the same amount of time worked?
Yeah, this is a great question. Like, is AI going to help people or companies even do more with less or do more with more, right? And so
I'm on team V, but I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Yeah, totally, right? I don't honestly know because, well, I should say it differently. I have a strong suspicion that you will do more with less, and here's why. On one hand, for a personal developer, I just do more with the power I have. I don't work less right now because I have big ambitions for where this podcast player is going. So I want to add more stuff. If I had more time, I would do more features because I have so many features in my head. Why do I think this isn't generally applicable? It's because of the mythical man month problem. Like, when you go to a company like Microsoft of 240,000 people, even when I worked there, it was 130,000 people, maybe in 2009, 2010, right? 130,000 back then is larger than the populations of 40 countries in the world. And so when you're writing software at that scale, you have internal governments and bureaucracies because like people management at that scale just requires that overhead. The reason I don't think you will just do more with more in that case is I think you actually get more efficient by cutting that company down to 120,000 from its 240 right now and having them be powered by AI to do more work because you reduce the communication overhead. The internal politics go way down when there are less people, right? The social capital goes way up. So there are a lot of efficiencies that I think a large company gains by deliberately trimming down that a small company like a one-person company does not gain.
Fascinating. So what does I'm a visual person, so I'm gonna ask you to paint me a picture. What does like a day in building look like for you? Like, what time do you usually start to what time do you usually kind of pull up to a computer? What does your environment look like? Are you kind of a music or in the quiet? If music, what do you kind of jam to? And how does like the concept of like vibing, which I know is a very kind of overused term these days, kind of fit into what building kind of is like today?
Yeah, and I'm probably not your typical developer in that in Cursor, although I've put my credit card in for the per use billing or whatever, I've never even come close to the low limits of their basic tier, right? So I probably don't use AI anywhere near the amount that some people do, even though I love using it. It's just that I find it frustrating to have to correct it a lot, and I see it getting better all the time. So I do suspect I will use it more, but I typically am an evening person, not a morning person. So I roll into my little WeWork. I rent a little tiny WeWork for myself, basically. And I find it helpful to go in. Like, I prefer to commute into work. And so I go in at probably, 10 a.m., right? And I tend to code till about 6. And then I go home. And in the evening, I might fix a few bugs and things like that in the off hours. And so that's my typical day. One thing that is very different potentially from how I'm developing versus most developers is I really want to evangelize the value of a 43-inch monitor. So these monitors are not expensive now. You pay like $800 or something, but they have more than 2,000 vertical pixels. And I think for a coder, being able to put like 4 panes of code side by side and each of them be 2,000 pixels high is like a massive performance gain. So that is my life hack recommendation to people.
That's awesome. I love that. And are you build with music or build in silence kind of guy?
Yeah. I sometimes like music and I tend to flip it all over the spectrum. So, like, sometimes it's piano. Of late, amusingly, I like playing soundtracks of random games I might have played recently. I don't know why that's amusing to me, but it's a real chuckle to hear that music coming out of a non-console, right? So,
Fun.
things like that.
And what's your take on like the vibing concept? I mean, so many people talk about like vibing an app to life. And what is that about?
I feel like it's very easy to vibe code something to Twitter, to X. Like, if you want to be able to brag on X that you just built Tetris in 30 minutes with graphics and everything, vibe coding is for you, right? I think going from that into a shipped product, I think most non-software people grossly underestimate that most of software development is not the coding of Tetris when you think of it. That is hardly the hard part of the problem. The hard part of the problem is getting your App Store account set up, and then these like signing certificates and how are you going to blah, 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 and then App Store like approvals. Like, so much of software development is honestly the quote unquote business of software, right? Is like all the overhead of managing everything not related to software, but related to a packaged product. That is, I think, part of it. But the other part, in fairness, though, is that for many things in software, you don't need to ship the product. AI has made it so that you can vibe code yourself little tools all day, right? Tools that before would never be justified to write. Like, it would never be justified for you to write a little tool to pull, I don't know, the latest Major League Baseball sports scores off of ESPN.com or whatever it is. Like, that would be ridiculous to spend a day doing that. But these days, spending 15 minutes doing that and running it on your own computer whenever you go into work, that's probably worth it, And
Right.
so I do think you're going to have a lot of non-technical people be able to empower themselves. And this is a great future because, as a software developer, as you know, when you show up and you look at any other industry, like, for instance, how plumbers schedule their appointments, right? How dental offices work their appointments. When you look at any industry as a software developer, you see the productivity gains they are forsaking simply because they might not understand what software could do for them. Right? There are these low-hanging fruit in every non-software thing that you've ever looked at. I think now this allows the dentist in his or her free time to say, like, hey, like, why don't we have a little script that whenever a customer checks in, we see it like when they last came in, and then we'll like welcome them saying like, hey, thanks for coming back after 4 months or whatever it is. You can imagine software being much more broadly distributed because the everyday person can now create little tiny tools for themselves. And I think that future is amazing. And the vibe coding, it doesn't have to be 100% correct for that to be valuable. Like the
Right.
dentist has something that she spent 30 minutes on that's better than what they've ever had, and it's certainly something they would never hire a developer in Seattle for $5,000 to write them like a script or something like that. So I do think it's going to pervade society a lot more in a good way.
Fascinating. I'm curious, piggybacking off of that. So, you made the shift from Meta to OpenAI, and was that after the ChatGPT moment, or was that in anticipation of that?
Yeah, so I joined OpenAI shortly after ChatGPT 4.
Shortly after ChatGPT 4. Okay, I can only assume what the attraction was because they were already kind of growing in such a viral way. But what was it like inside of OpenAI? What were your eyes open to with regards to how AI is developed and what AI can do, and how did that shift your perspective on you know and insert whatever it might have shifted your perspective on?
Yeah, totally. I first applied to join OpenAI when DALI was first released, so almost a year before I actually joined. And back then they were so busy, like nobody got back to me, and so that kind of went nowhere. And then a year later, I applied again. And the reason I applied is I had been trying to convince friends for a year to use Copilot, Microsoft Copilot within VS Code, because I found that useful. And I had a really hard time convincing friends to do so. It was very difficult. And I felt like the future was definitely going that direction. And so when ChatGPT 4 came out, I thought, I've got to be a part of this because I think of all the big transitions in humanity, you definitely had the Industrial Revolution being huge, agriculture, forming cities being huge. After that, the internet, huge transition for humanity, right? I think AI may well be larger than the internet when it comes to the impact of what's happening, because we might be the first species in the universe to create something smarter than we are. And that just goes very nonlinear and very odd once you think about the implications of that. So when I saw that happening, I thought, wow, it would be amazing to be part of something so foundational to how human society runs. And so that was great. I joined OpenAI when it was probably 120 developers total. So it was smaller than when I joined Facebook. And it was super exciting. Like the work hours were nuts, but that's to be expected. And it's not because people were necessarily making you work long hours. It was just because the excitement is so great of what you're working on. You can see it improve every day. And also, the other thing is, it was very clear that competition was coming. It was very clear that Google with 50x the engineers, and with much more stable platforms and whatnot, were definitely had all the advantages. And so you had to run as quickly as you could. So I found it really exciting. The average caliber of the engineer there is extremely high. So I found day to day that I learned a bunch.
Incredible. Yeah, it feels like a important moment in history, like you described it, and great place to be a kind of a participating fly on the wall for that kind of moment of time that you were there.
Yeah, totally. I, as a person who doesn't know much about AIs and building language models, I was grateful for the opportunity to work on the product side of things, the actual ChatGPT product, because I'm ultimately a product guy. Like, I think so many products are built poorly. I have ideas for how to improve them. I use them all the time. So I appreciated being able to be a fly on the wall and just to be sort of inside the factory in a way to see how things are made.
Interesting. And what is it like inside of the factory? Whatever you're able to share, paint us a picture of what it's what it was like there.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of energy within the company. The excitement is definitely very real. And I think the excitement comes in two forms. One is the excitement of new features you're about to build or release, right? But the other is the type of excitement that happens when there's a fire drill every other day, right? The infrastructure is still being built there, understandably, because the company became an overnight success in a way that wasn't expected. Like, of course, it was years in the making to get to that success point. But I think ChatGPT 2 or something had something like 30,000 users, something like this, some small number, right? And so when they released ChatGPT 3, it was not expected to get millions of users. It was expected to get, I don't know, 50,000, something like this. And so because of that unexpected success, a lot of the infrastructure had to be built while the plane was flying, let's say, right? And it had to be built as hastily as possible because the staff was so tiny. And so I feel like that part of the excitement came from the infrastructure constantly breaking. And I'm sure that's a lot better now because the investments that have been made into infrastructure, making it stable and predictable and reliable, is a lot better.
Fascinating. And the story continues to stay fascinating, obviously on the kind of like bleeding edge of relevance in technology. You have, OpenAI and doing everything that it's doing. And now, Google is, certainly leaning in with all they're doing with Gemini and AI and DeepMind. And then Elon's, pushing the boundaries with Grok. They just, released a new model. And Meta is, investing in their super intelligence lab. Like, now that you've moved on from OpenAI, you could have an objective perspective. What's your take on what's all going on in AI, and where do we go from here?
I think from a competition perspective, competition is always better for the customer, right? So I love the idea that there's so many people producing AIs. And unlike social networking platforms, I wonder if this is really a winner take all thing. Like, it feels to me like a future world full of different companies that specialize with different types of AI. seems quite believable to me. Whereas if you told me like, hey, there's going to be Mastodon and X and like all these different tweeting platforms and you can tweet on all of them, I get skeptical because I do think there are network effects in those sorts of businesses. It's not clear to me that AI is winner take all. So I think a likely future is that there will be a lot of AI companies and a lot of AI products that do specific things well, right? At different price points, for instance, is a classic example. So I do think that future is likely to happen. I'm more concerned about the societal impact because I fear that our government and maybe world governments won't adapt quickly enough to the societal change that will happen. In the olden days, right? And I'm talking like 1,000 years ago, right? 1,000 years ago, one might in Europe have the philosophy, the Old Testament Christian philosophy of, he who does not work shall not eat, right? That used to be a philosophy. I think that's a fine attitude to have as long as everybody who's willing to work can work. Then that's that's reasonable to say, hey, you have to contribute to society. We're not just going to give you stuff. Like you have to be part of our village, right? But I think that only works as an ethic or a system of government when everybody who is willing to work can work. I think we might be approaching a point for which white collar work is the first, it seems, to go. We used to think with the Jetsons that the robots would clean our houses while we did art and music and all this stuff. And it turns out that the robots first came for the art and the music, and we're still cleaning our own houses, right? So I think that in a world in which white collar work might no longer be compensated because you cannot out IQ the AI, right? I think in that world, we really have to decide, are we going to have the philosophy that he who does not work shall not eat, right? And I think a good society doesn't have that philosophy, most likely. But I also doubt that our government has the ability to proactively anticipate that future the way that Andrew Yang, even in 2016 in the elections, was trying to say, this future is coming. We need to adapt the government to make sure that the people are protected from this future, right? I don't know if we're going to be able to make that transition. And I'm very worried that we aren't putting in the right systems of governance to make sure that happens well for our society.
And only the future will tell. But I know, the two sides of that debate is like on the one hand is the the AI is coming for our jobs, right? And we had a really interesting kind of moment yesterday when we were catching up about you're like appreciating the opportunity to build right now because who knows when that opportunity might be taken away if AI is able to do it better, right? So that's do you really see a world where engineers don't have room to work anymore because AI just does it better? And I guess then on the other hand, right, the other argument is that AI and humans will, be great kind of counterparts and, evolve to be more, productive and effective and advanced than, the pre-AI world.
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't know. I think in fairness, in context, my opinion is a minority opinion. Most of my friends laugh at me for being Luddite. They feel like I am making the same logical error everybody in history has ever made whenever new technology comes out, which is every past technology, the loom, the Industrial Revolution, like all these things. Every technology, people said like, oh, we're going to eliminate jobs. This is terrible. And it turns out that even more jobs are out there, right? Than were ever out there. So I do acknowledge that history is on the other side of my argument and that the preponderance of evidence suggests that I'm way wrong with my speculation. But I'll make a valiant defense for why I believe this time is different. And I know how bizarre that sounds whenever someone says that. I think when we replaced jobs 20 years ago, we had this vision that we would retrain people. Let's go way back first, right? People often say, well, Philip, you say all this, but in 1910, 40% of the American population was involved in food production, farmers and like things like that. Now it's less than 4%. So things are fine, right? And I'd say, yeah, things are fine, but we never told the farmer himself, set down the plow, become a social media director, right? What we told the farmer is, your son should go to college, is what we told him. That farmer lived out his farming life just fine. His son became a hoity-toity Wall Street person, right? The difference now is we are telling the actual farmer, the analogous farmer in modern society, we are telling them, you need to find a different job right now. And in fact, that job in 3 years might also be fundamentally eliminated. So you
Right.
need to maybe change the subsequent job in 18 months, right? And so I think one huge difference is the time scale at which this is happening. And that time scale, even if it's true, even if I'm wrong and I'm Luddite, and it's true that in 2100, like we'll have spaceships and the Roomba finally works and your house is being vacuumed by a robot. Even if that were true, the interstitial time between now and then is going to be, I think, very chaotic, and chaotic in a potentially bad societal way. So I'm concerned about that. The second difference that I will highlight, so the first is temporal, right? It's going to happen a lot faster. And it's not going to only happen faster, but the AI is already modifying itself. So it will happen faster,
Right.
which is a concept that most people like can't even grok the faster, right? But the faster just gets nuts, right? The second thing that's different about it is we used to tell people to retrain, and that was a fine thing to do because there were many other jobs for which they could easily be retrained for that society would appreciate them doing. What if you are the type of white collar worker where a lot of other white collar jobs you wanted to train into and are capable of training into are also jobs that AI is doing? At this point, it's not like we just, when it comes to like, why don't we just do more with more? Like, why don't we employ every American citizen to do just even more than they've ever done? I feel like that is a fine thing to do as long as every American can do something that is commercially valuable better than AI can do it. And it's not clear to me that will always be the case.
Right.
And lastly, I'll say one last reason why I'm more concerned about this than most people. Most people poo-poo it because it's like, well, we still have 4% farmers. Things are fine, right? People forget that American unemployment, if it ever hits 4%, we're in a world of hurt. Like 6% is like heading toward depression territory, right? You don't need to replace 98% of jobs for there to, quote unquote, be a problem. You only need to, right now in America, replace about 4% of jobs for there to be massive societal problems, right? And so I feel like people are mistaking what I'm saying. I am not saying the AI is going to take, quote unquote, all of our jobs. I'm saying if you can even imagine AI taking 5% of the jobs, we will have a massive societal problem that we need to go deal with. And so those three are the reasons why I continue to insist that despite all historical evidence, that quote unquote, I am still right and this time is different.
Two kind of quick hit questions. What's your prediction for when, what year will the next what year will the next presidential election be ran on this as an issue? That's question number one. That's the first question. What year do you think this will be the main issue?
Yeah, I would be surprised if something AI related was not the main issue by the next election in America. And here's the reason, because I think there are two fronts on it. One is obviously the work front, which is, what's my job, what's happening with my stuff, right? But I think another thing which people might not attribute to AI, but I think is related to AI, is the rising income and wealth gap in America is spreading even further. And I think not everybody is attributing this to the right causes. It's not that coastal elites are running off with their lattes, from tattooed baristas. That's not what's actually happening. I think what's happening is when a robot replaces a person's job, let's say
Latte.
on the right.
Coastal elite here with a latte.
Totally. So let's say when Amazon replaces a factory worker in a fulfillment center on the line, right? When they replace that person on the line, that robot's output doesn't accrue to that former worker's future benefits, right? That robot's output accrues to the intellectual property owner. So I think what's going to happen with AI is most of the value accrues to the intellectual property owner of the AI, not to the people that even honestly created it or the people whose jobs were replaced. And so I think even if AI weren't directly the topic being debated, it will cause a greater gap in wealth and income in America. And that will cause social tensions, whether or not people are attributing it to the right thing. Lastly, even if that weren't the problem, I think international competition with AI starts to become an interesting debate and an interesting sort of thing that I think will also raise tensions. For instance, if a country that says death to America is part of their slogan, if they start becoming very good at AI in the military, like we obviously would have to amp up our military spend on AI, and there would be a sort of a arms race in a way, right? An arms race not to be eliminated, to basically preserve the American way of life. I feel like that will also potentially be contentious a few years from now, because you can see investments by other world countries in this domain that could turn militaristic.
Fascinating. I could definitely see the world moving in that direction. So, because a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to be engineers or building companies that involve engineers, in 60 seconds, tell the world of engineers, given your view of the world, where they should focus their energies.
I think my 3-word summary would be winter is coming. That is my warning. Winter is coming.
I mean, should engineers go become plumbers, or should engineers adapt to some hybrid AI development model?
I don't know, and I think anybody who claims to know is almost definitely wrong. Like 5 years ago, right, we really still thought the AI was going to free us to do art and music. But in fact, it does art and music better than the average person can do art or music, right? So, and people often mistake this. People often say like, oh, blah, 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 this is so blah, blah, blah. Like someone once told me, ChatGPT is not going to make a good writer Hemingway. It will make the average writer, who is bad, a fairly passable writer, right? I think this is what's happening. AI art is not going to make a great artist. It's not going to make Banksy better, right? Okay. What it is going to do for the average person like me, who can barely do a pencil sketch for the back of a minivan of stick figures of my family, for a person like me, it's going to enable me to do some interesting art for my software, right? So I think that there's this sort of leveling question. But when it comes to the future, what I mean by winter is coming is there are still 4% of Americans involved in agriculture. It didn't go to zero. And so there will always be, I think, software developers. There might just be 1/10 of the number there are today. And so if you can climb above that rising tide onto the increasingly smaller island of safety, right? If you're one of those developers that is good enough to push into that top 50% of developers, and maybe in 3 years, the top 25% of developers, you will be fine. For everybody else, I think winter is coming means gather nuts like a squirrel, right? Is like, what can you do to spend less than you earn right now? What can you do to save? What can you do to invest in the things that I think our society will generate value from, so that you become a stakeholder in that future society, as opposed to a person who is essentially run over by technical progress?
I love that. I love where we ended up getting to, and some of the implications of this. And I'm glad that we're kind of memorializing this, so to say, so we can look back on it to see how we did. But thank you so much, Philip, for joining us on this podcast. Question, Philip, where can people reach you if they want to reach you, and what should their first message to you be? What do you want to hear from people about?
Yeah, great question. People can hit me up. I'm online. Superphonic is my podcast player, which I'm happy for people to try and give me feedback on Discord regarding that, because it is a small project with just 2 developers on it, so I love hearing from people. I'm writing a Substack called Malacanations, and so you can find me on Substack, where I discuss careers and governance, things like that. And for a lot longer things, I wrote a book for my son, a 220-page book called Caleb's Guide, and it covers things like software careers, personal finance, like life stuff. That's just for general chuckles. And so those are the types of places that you can see my work.
I love that. I'm gonna have to check out that guide, see what career direction you're encouraging in there. Thank you again, Philip, for joining us. It's a pleasure chatting.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
And that's a wrap. If you're still watching this, thank you. I do hope you enjoyed today's episode. Drop me a comment or review it on Apple or YouTube or Spotify, and also, share, subscribe, because that is the only way to get the algorithm's attention these days, By the way, if there is a guest you want to recommend, or have a recruiting related question, or you need help with anything at all hiring related, just drop us a note on our website. That's www.first10.com, or hit me up on my socials. you can check the show notes for my Twitter and LinkedIn. My name is Boris Epstein, and this is the First 10 Podcast.